Group number 1.
Honourable member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
Mr. Speaker, I'm delighted to rise today to speak on Bill C-50, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act in relation to political financing. The Government of Canada promised to set a higher bar on the transparency, accountability, and integrity of public institutions and the democratic process. We also said that we take steps to ensure that Canada's elections are run more fairly, and we promise to encourage more Canadians, and in particular, youth and Indigenous Canadians, to play a more active role in our democracy. Canada's Minister of Democratic Institutions has taken this role seriously. Since she received this mandate from the Prime Minister in January, she has been encouraging Canadians to become more involved, to expand their civic literacy. This isn't just about voting or volunteering for a campaign. Canadians can expand their civic literacy by simply engaging in discussions with their friends and neighbors at coffee shops or online or through public policy issues that matter to them. Participation can mean volunteering for a charity, joining a community organization, or signing a petition. Democracy has many wide open doors for those that want to enter and play a part. We want to make sure all voices are heard. One issue that has come up in the media and in the House relates to federal rules governing the funding of political parties. Political parties are, of course, fundamental to our system of the government. If Canadians have concerns about how the government regulates them, then I think those concerns must be addressed. The concerns raised in Parliament relate to private fundraising events. Now, Mr. Speaker, we are proud of Canada's strong reputation in running elections. Our system is recognized as one of the most progressive in the world. Elections Canada, as we know, regularly hosts delegations from countries wanting to learn from our system. But the government recognizes that some Canadians want their government to do more to increase transparency. These Canadians have asked questions about fundraising activities. So we believe, Mr. Speaker, that steps are necessary. That is why the government is creating a new level of transparency. We want to empower Canadians, including opposition parties and the media, to take a much closer look at fundraising in Canada. As I mentioned, our current laws are relatively strict. Canadian citizens and permanent residents can contribute a maximum of $1,550 annually to each registered party. They can donate $1,550 in total to all leadership contestants in a particular contest. In addition, they can donate a total of $1,550 to contestants for nomination, candidates and/or riding associations of each registered party. These upper limits are among the lowest in the democratic world. In fact, some other democratic countries have no limit, which of course raises serious concerns about money influencing decisions. Here in Canada, contributions are reported to Elections Canada, and the name, municipality, province, and postal code of those that contribute more than 200 are published online. Bill C-50 builds on that solid foundation of transparency. This legislation would apply to all fundraising activities attended by cabinet ministers, including the Prime Minister, party leaders, and leadership contestants when a contribution or ticket price of more than 200 is required of any attendee. The name and partial address of each attendee, with certain exceptions, will be published online. The exceptions are youth under 18, volunteers, event staff, media, and support staff for the minister or party leader in attendance. Parties would be required to report the names and partial addresses of attendees to Election Canada within 30 days of the event. That information would then become public. These provisions apply to all parties with a seat in the House of Commons. Bill C-50 would require parties to advertise fundraising events at least 5 days in advance. Canadians would know about a political fundraiser before the event takes place, giving them an opportunity to inquire about the attending if they wish. Bill C-50 would also give journalists the ability to determine when and where fundraisers are happening. At the same time, political parties would retain the flexibility to set their own rules for providing media access and accreditation. The bill would also introduce new offences in the Canada Elections Act for those who don't respect the rules and require the return of any money collected at the event. These sanctions would apply to political parties, parties' agents, and event organizers rather than the senior political leaders invited to the events. The government proposes a maximum of $1,000 fine on summary conviction for offenses introduced under Bill C-50, and if rules are broken, then contributions collected at the events would have to be returned. I should note, Mr. Speaker, that we have decided to limit the application of the new framework during the writ period. This is to avoid imposing an unduly heavy burden during elections when campaign organizers and their many volunteers and colleagues are working around the clock to get their message to Canadians. Reports on events that occur during the writ period will only be required following polling day. Mr. Speaker, it is important to note, for us, we debate this legislation to collectively send a message to Canadians, and that there is nothing wrong with a legal campaign and its contributions. Political parties need to have access to adequate political funds so they can get their message to Canadians, to engage them, and in our democratic process. Candidates and their teams must be able to pay for the office rent, buy lawn signs, and occasionally order some pizza and pop for their dedicated and tireless volunteers. Making a contribution is also an important form of democratic expression in Canada. This is a big step many of thousands of Canadians take in order to show emphatically their support for a political party or candidate. The fact is, in every developed democratic country, parties are funded either privately, by the public sector, or quite often a combination of both. We should also acknowledge there is nothing inherently wrong with someone trying to get their message through to decision makers. Politicians are solicited in numerous ways, at crowded town halls, gatherings, at meetings, in an MP's office, and at local skating rinks. I will conclude by returning to the initial focus of this address. The government has promised Canadians a new level of openness and transparency. At the same time, the government is determined to protect the Charter of Rights of all citizens to participate in our democracy. I believe the government has found the right balance with Bill C-50. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question and commentaire, the Honourable Member for Victoria.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague across the way for his remarks on Bill C-50. He talked about parties having to report the attendees at fundraisers within 30 days of the event and advance notice being provided 5 days in advance. I'd like to ask through you, Mr. Speaker, whether my colleague agrees that this bill simply validates and normalizes cash for access events, and that by simply providing notice of who was there, we have made no difference to the reality of fundraising of this kind, which in many people's mind undermines our democracy.
The Honourable Member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. Now, we have a very robust system here in Canada. Our limits are modest, and we don't allow contributions from unions or corporations. But we also recognize that we have a protected right under the Charter, Section 2, I believe. But our government is striving to make sure we're very open and transparent. So we're changing the rules of reporting from the 6 to 9 months to 30 days. And we've actually front-end loaded this by allowing individuals to know who will be attending a fundraiser in advance. And I commend our government for taking these steps and initiatives. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question and commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the comments from my colleague. And one of the aspects of the legislation that I'm actually quite proud of is the fact that within the legislation, we're going to now see whether you're the Prime Minister of Canada or ministers of Canada, but in particular also opposition leaders. Opposition leaders, whether you're the leader of the New Democratic Party or the Conservative Party, that there is an obligation also to be indicating who it is that you're meeting with when they're paying $250 to attend these fundraisers. The commissioner, the ethics commissioner, is actually on the record, the former commissioner, Mary Dawson, indicating that this legislation is in fact a step forward. And I'm wondering if my colleague would just provide his thoughts in regards to how this legislation will ensure more transparency and accountability when it comes to electoral reform.
The honourable member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. As he stated, the revisions have been reviewed and received quite positively. In fact, C-50 was studied at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and most witnesses responded positively. And the acting CEO actually indicated that the bill was an effective and measured tool to increase transparency. Both the Ethics and Lobbying Commissioner also said the bill would help them do their investigation. So I too am quite proud that we've added these revisions, and we've also tightened up the reporting times so that the transparency actually occurs in an expedited manner. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the honourable member if he doesn't see a difference between fundraisers that attract the decision makers of a government, ministers and parliamentary secretaries, and indeed the Prime Minister, and opposition members who aren't in a position, Mr. Speaker, to give contracts for this or that or provide jobs to people. Is there not a pretty significant difference between that? So isn't the talking points that the government uses for this bill a little misleading? And secondly, why is it, Mr. Speaker, through you, I'd ask the question that none of the recommendations of the Ethics Committee on this bill were accepted?
The honourable member for Mississauga-Streetsville.
I'd like to thank the member for his question. This isn't about talking points. This is about striving to be more accountable to Canadians. Now, I'm sure my colleague can agree that the NDP have made mistakes. $2.7 million had to be returned for certain offices, $1 million back to the Canada Post. The previous government has made mistakes. The fact is, our government's open about it, and we're striving to do better and be accountable to Canadians. Thank you.
Resuming debate.